Thank you for braving the cold and coming out tonight to this lecture. This is the final lecture in our year-long series of talks covering different facets of the periodic table. And as you probably know, we're celebrating the International Year of the Periodic Table. It's the 150th anniversary of Mendeleev's discovery of the periodic table. And we wanted to highlight this year in different talks the ways that the periodic table of elements has changed our lives, not just in chemistry, which is a fairly obvious way, but in all sciences, and even in terms of other things that we don't necessarily think of as just science, like geopolitics. So I've been particularly excited for this lecture because we'll see how science and the world and politics, culture all interact with one another. And let me tell you about tonight's speaker. Before I do that, we give away t-shirts at the end of every lecture, so stay tuned. Right after the question and answer session, we'll be giving away some t-shirts. But about today's speaker, so Margaret Kosal was trained as an experimental scientist, and she has a PhD in chemistry from the University of Illinois. But now she is an associate professor in the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs here at Georgia Tech, and directs the Sam Nunn Security Program and the Program on Emerging Technology and Security. And she's also a member of the Parker Pettit Institute for Biosciences. She's written a book called Nanotechnology for Chemical and Biological Defense. And she's an editor-in-chief for Politics in Life Sciences and does various other things. She is also a senior advisor to the Chief of Staff of the Army and a science technology advisor in the Department of Defense. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Margaret Kozel, who will be telling us about geopolitics of the elements.
Matt, thank you very much for the kind invitation and the introduction. Thank you all for coming out. So I'm going to be talking about the geopolitics of the elements and how elements, in particularly through an American lens, as well as a broader world lens, have interacted with political, social, in particular in the construct of conflict. So I'm going to go back. And here we have the Secretary of War, Lewis Cass. This is a writing to Congress. And what he is doing here is he is saying that Congress should fund George Featherstonehaugh to complete his survey of America, essentially the Louisiana Purchase at this time, identifying specifically what are minerals, what are the natural resources for use in the growing America of 1833. Now, this is coming from the Secretary of War. At the time, that would be equivalent to the Secretary of Defense, because there was no Department of Defense. This, in and of itself, shows how important and the recognition of the importance of some of these minerals in terms of not only just the Department of Interior, but in a much more strategic or geopolitical way. Again, this is coming from the Secretary of War. It's not coming from the Secretary of Interior, which is who we usually associate with things like surveying American lands. I should note that what this effectively is what we would today think of as a research proposal. Instead of submitting to an agency, this is Featherstonehaugh has submitted, it says memoriam, but he's very much alive, He has submitted an initial report, so you might call it initial results. And then those initial results, the Secretary of War is submitting to Congress to say, please fund this because Congress appropriates. So a little bit different of a funding mechanism than we deal with. Moving forward, I want to talk about Einstein's letter to Roosevelt. Now, throughout this talk, there are probably going to be things that you've heard of before. Many of you might have heard of Einstein's letter to Roosevelt before. Hopefully, there's going to be something that you haven't heard of before. So, Einstein's letter to Roosevelt, in some ways, is a trivial pursuit question, because Einstein didn't write it. He did. It was actually written by Leo Szilard, and I know I am not pronouncing his last name correctly, but that's the way I'm going to continue to pronounce it. Apologies to the Szilard family. So Szilard, who was a physicist, composed the letter. And I recognize that you're probably not going to be able to make out the details unless perhaps you're an undergrad who has really good eyesight. Szilard composed the letter. Even in the 1940s, he recognized that if he wanted to get this to the attention of the political people who could make things happen, leveraging the prestige, leveraging the nature of Einstein as a celebrity was something he would be worthwhile. So going through this, he outlines, and again, this is written by, it's written by Szilard, signed by Einstein, where he says, look, some recent work by Fermi and Szilard, he's making sure that he gets his name mentioned in there, so here we have the citations, which has been communicated to me in a manuscript, leads me to expect that the element uranium may be turned into a new and important source of energy in the immediate future. He goes through and articulates, again, we get Fermi and Szilard, along with Joliet, that they've done this work that may become possible to set up a nuclear chain reaction. And then here's where we get to the geostrategic piece, number one. This new phenomena would also lead to the construction, and it is conceivable, though much less certain, that extremely powerful bombs of a new type may thus be constructed. So I highlight that to illustrate how, at the time, the role that nuclear weapons would play in dominating the strategic forces of the 20th century was not recognized. Initially, these weapons were conceived of as just bigger conventional bombs. Wasn't known. It even talks about here in the last thing, it might be too heavy for transportation by air. The engineers and scientists of the Manhattan Project, particularly at Los Alamos, take care of that. So then we get to the second critical geostrategic piece. The United States has only very poor ores of uranium in moderate quantities. There's good ore in Canada, the former Czechoslovakia, while the most important source of uranium is Belgium Congo, or what we would call the Democratic Republic of the Congo today. He goes on to recommend setting up an advisory panel and some funding for scientists. So then let's move to the mine where over 40% of the initial uranium came from. Now, I'm not going to try to pronounce this. I think it's Shinkolabwa mine. This is the name of the mine, open pit mining, that for reasons of geology naturally is high in the uranium ore that is used to then isolate down eventually to fissile material. This was the source of the uranium ore that was used for the first atomic weapon used in wartime. This is General Leslie Groves, the Army general who was in charge of the Manhattan Project, By the way, his warm-up act for the Manhattan Project was he managed the construction of the Pentagon. And he got it to be built under time and under budget. His next big thing was, can you oversee the building of the first nuclear weapon? So this is an image of Groves meeting with Edgar Senghir. So he's the director of this mine in Congo. And they're meeting because he already has pre-positioned ore under a bridge in Manhattan that is just waiting for the Americans to come and say, hey, we need this for purposes of the war. Because he's a Belgian, and at this time, the Nazis have occupied Belgium. So he is representing the government in exile, which is at the time in the UK. This was fairly well known 1950 onward. What is more recent, and Susan Williams' recent book highlights this, was the role that the predecessor to the CIA played. So the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, they were the CIA along with some other things, sort of CIA plus special forces of the time. He dispatched, in particular the director, Wild Bill Donovan, who then became one of the first directors of the CIA, dispatches Wilbur Doc Hogue to be the chief of station. Hogue happens to be someone who's an engineer by training, and they are initially sent there to ensure that the Germans do not get this uranium ore. So it is such a secret mission that they never mention uranium. They talk about it, it's called the diamonds. Because there are diamond mines there, but really we were not concerned about the diamonds, we were concerned about the uranium. This mine remained our major source of uranium as our nuclear arsenal was developed into the mid-1950s. In fact, there was a NATO air base in Kamina was built for defense of Central Africa against international communism, aka making sure that we have access to that uranium mine. So moving forward, Western Sahara, and this may be one that people have not heard of, may not have even heard of Western Sahara. Western Sahara is sometimes called the last colony in Africa. So initially, Western Sahara was a Spanish colony. The Spain left Western Sahara, were kicked out, in the 1970s. It was then seized by Morocco. We know the importance of phosphorus, particularly as chemists, we're familiar with the importance of phosphorus because of the Green Revolution of the 1960s, the original Green Revolution, not the current sort of Green Revolution environmentalism. So Western Sahara, this is areas where more than 70% of known phosphate reserves are located. This is where the phosphorus comes from. This one specific mine, Bukroa, here, is about 15% of the world's production. Literally has the longest conveyor belt, hundreds of miles, that goes from this mine to the seaport. And it is well armed because you've got an insurgent group, technically they're an irredentist group, called the Polisario Front. Now these guys are serious. Now this is some of their capabilities. They have been fighting for their own nationhood, because they are a unified specific ethnic group, since before the Spanish left. Formed in 1975, if I recall, the Spanish left in 1975. So you've got, they're now still fighting against Morocco. Why does Morocco want to have Western Sahara? Well, there are multiple reasons. One of them was in the Cold War, this was seen as an area that they wanted to limit the movement of communist states, communist influenced states. But there certainly is a component of this that Morocco wants to continue to hold this land because of the phosphorus production. UN has been in and out of Western Sahara. Particularly, there's this MINURSO. This is a peacekeeping group between the Western Saharans and Morocco. It's been characterized as the worst police state that I've ever seen by one UN observer. Something that we often don't hear about in the United States. We have all heard of WikiLeaks. Well, there was a Moroccan version of WikiLeaks, and this was called MarcoLeaks. They were referred to as the Moroccan Snowden, in which US, French, and other diplomatic cables were leaked starting in October 2014. This is the Twitter feed of the individual who is doing most of these leaking. It's Chris Coleman. This is just a fake name. So this individual's been leaking a variety of different documents, ones that highlight what's called the Mahsen, and that is the royal court. So the king and all of the government that goes around in that. Claims that Moroccan officials have bribed diplomats to ensure that they support the king's position. This is an example of a real document. Now, some of these in the Morocco leaks are fabricated or forged. Others are legitimate real documents. This is one that appears to be legitimate. This is from the embassy in Canada, so dealing with the Australian government, pressure to try to make the Australian government not deal with Western Sahara, and asserting that there were bribes that were paid to ensure that the Australians turned a blind eye to what was going on. It has spurred a number of social media campaigns. If you go today on Twitter and try to find this site, you'll find that it doesn't exist anymore. It's been turned off. But given the world that we are in today and the social media of today, what this initial Marco leaks has spurred then is a number of other sites, Sahara Voice being one of them, this Western Sahara, another one, which has created through social media and this broader network an effort to raise awareness and then also to target back to those countries. So here's what it has to do with Bermuda. One fascinating example, this was New Zealand. So you see there December 20th, the Saharan side, Western Saharan side, saying this is what's going on. New Zealand is starting to put together to try to make this new agreement with Morocco, ignoring the Western Saharan side. You then get the New Zealanders protesting, and then the next level of iteration, you've got the Western Saharan social media using that which they got started as part of their propaganda, or you could say campaign, furthering their political interests. Now again, why is Morocco concerned about Western Sahara? At this point, since communism is no longer the threat, it is purely monetarily driven. You have a group of people, an ethnic group, nation of the Western Saharans, who are being subjected to an extremely repressive government connected to phosphorus. Cobalt. Again, we've all probably heard of blood diamonds. So cobalt sometimes has been called the blood mineral. So Congo crisis of 1960-65, this was the initial anti-colonialist war. Time shut down the production of cobalt. More recently, this is an example of what we call in international relations or international development the resource curse. These developing nations that have large natural resources, instead of investing those into the population, what you end up with is corruption, and you end up with typically a great disparity and lack of international development. And it correlates. Places where there's large amounts of oil, typically you do not have the development, particularly in Africa. So looking at cobalt through this resource curse idea, you've got one mine in DRC in the southeast province. This is a province that has a significant amount of conflict going on, in sectarian conflict. That supplies about 60% of the cobalt globally. Cobalt is used in a variety of electronic devices and is becoming more important in terms of batteries and some other energy devices. And here we connect it to other geopolitical issues, which is China, the PRC, increasingly becoming involved in Africa. So we have a Congolese, if you want to be the king of the world in the next 10 years, you need to have cobalt. Next 10 years it will be everything. Okay, so he's the general manager of this mine. Of course, he wants to push that. This mine is a subsidiary of a PRC, a state-owned enterprise. So you're seeing an example of a significant geostrategic mineral, China having control of the single largest source. Broader strategic issues than cobalt alone. There has been a fair bit of press, there's been a fair bit of attention that's gotten to the issue particularly. So this is an 11-year-old boy who's carrying the cobalt mining, carrying away some of the raw material. Now they have, if you're going in, you're supposed to have to pass through into the mine. Here you say, no pregnant women, no children, and you're not allowed to bring in alcohol either. How effective this is, that remains to be seen. But due to attention, particularly this Fortune piece has gotten a fair bit of international attention, so we're at least seeing some changes dealing with the development and the human rights issues. This is the next issue to deal with. Which then brings us to the rare earth elements. We got to talk about rare earths because they're in the media in a number of different ways. So these are the rare earth elements that are in your Apple iPhone or any Apple product. These are not all of the rare earth elements, but those are just the ones that are in your Apple iPhone that is put together in Foxconn in Shenzhen in China. So why are the rare earth elements significant? Well, first of all, it isn't so much that they are rare in the sense that there isn't a lot of them, is they are so dispersed. And I'm going to talk a little bit more in a few slides about the process. Rare earth elements were things that were formed as supernova and that came to rest in the earth. They are incredibly important for a variety of applications. I'm going to highlight the applications that have defense significance, but there certainly are commercial applications that are of economic significance, as well as biomedical, any of your other critical infrastructures. Looking at rare earth elements, so guidance and control systems. Whether we're talking about Tomahawk missiles off of a naval ship, unmanned aircraft, so your drones, any of the munitions that we build our deterrence capabilities on now have rare earth elements that are part of the guidance and control systems, command and control. This is targeting and weapons systems. If we're talking about laser targeting, all of these depend on different rare earth elements. Some of it's part of the actual laser. Some of it is part of the amplification. You need to have small amounts of these elements in order to have these capabilities. In DoD speak, you usually don't talk about technologies per se. You talk about you have capabilities, and that's a code word for technologies. One more, so communications. Whether we're talking about being able to communicate through water, sonar, radar, while radar well predates most of the rare earth elements, modern version of radar, again, command and control and the communications is dependent upon having access to different rare earth elements. This is one close to my heart, the MICAD. So here we have a chemical agent alarm. As was mentioned in the introduction, I previously spent time working in the Office of Secretary of Defense. Part of it was within the development of countermeasures for chemical, biological, and nuclear incidents or weapons. So this is taken from the Defense National Stockpile. This is a DoD publication. You can see that I've just pulled out the odd numbers. I wasn't going to go through and belabor all of them, but there are more applications that these are important for. This is an issue that has gotten a lot of attention. Here's an example that's coming out of the Office of Secretary of Defense. The acquisitions, technology, and logistics, those are the folks that have all the money in the DoD. And we're hearing about new programs that the DoD is funding to ensure that we have access to these capabilities. So why are rare earth elements a geopolitical issue? The United States actually has excellent natural areas to find rare earths. There's a place called Mountain Pass in California that is a mine that was one of the original mines for rare earths. It closed initially in the 1990s. It was reopened in about 2010, again closed in 2012. So we do have rare earths sources of these minerals within the United States as well as within a whole number of allies. Other places, Australia, we have an agreement with Australia for if we need rare earths for something or if they need rare earths, bilateral agreement. Another place that there's a great interest actually is Afghanistan, has some significant supply of rare earths, but what we hear about mostly is China. And there are two main areas in China that are sort of the rare earth sectors. Inner Mongolia, and then in sort of the Guangzhou, Sichuan, sort of the southern area. Now, why do we get our rare earths from China? We have to go a little bit into the process of how you get these rare earths. So this is one of the, and then up here, one of the most concise graphics, blatantly stolen from foreign policy. You start with 40 metric tons of rock to get 750 kilograms of some rare earths and 250 kilograms of the really critical rare earths. This is an incredibly intensive process. And they're called rare earths because there are such small concentrations. So you have to go through and start with a whole lot of rock and repeatedly subject it to a variety of physical and chemically intensive processes to separate that. It is environmentally devastating or extremely expensive. And that is why Mountain Pass mine in California is not economically viable. Because if you want to do these steps in a way that does not kill people and other living things, you can't do it cheap enough, or you can't do it in competition with the PRC. Because yes, they do have regulations. That does not mean that those regulations are enforced. This is where rule of law becomes critical. We're actually enforcing the regulations. This is from Inner Mongolia. It's been a fair bit of attention. One of the mines where they're just pumping out acidified effluent, and it has destroyed what had previously been a lake where people would fish and was a source of water. Got a couple other images. This is a typical lab where it's part of the few steps down in the process. So when we look at, is it a strategic issue? Yes, we need to have access to, unquestionably, to these minerals. Currently, this is a political question. How much money do we want to spend to have access to these in a way that fits with our ideals and our expectations for not killing our own citizens? So currently, we can still get the minerals we need from China. This is changing, particularly as China is increasing in its status economically. The Chinese population is not going to be putting up with this. It's not in the same way as the United States, because PRC and Communist Chinese Party, but you do have groups that are pushing back, and this is the triumph of capitalism at some point, that they're going to be making too much money, still small compared to us, that this won't be viable any longer. Okay, a couple more incidents. The fishing boat incidents become really important in the sense of an example in which China asserted, or it is asserted, that China used their rare earths to influence another nation. So there are a group of islands in China, there are a group of islands that are disputed between China and Japan, and frequently they have interactions. And there have been multiple ones where you've got Japanese Coast Guard with a Chinese fishing vessel. This is from one incident in 2014 in which the captain of the fishing vessel was arrested. In response, China threatened to limit sale of rare earths to Japan. Japan makes a lot of high-intensity electronics. So unquestionably, China threatened that. There is, you can go see the statements that they threaten this. What often doesn't get followed through on in discussions is they threatened it, but they never followed through on that. So it's more complicated. It isn't just one Two, it's even China's looking at this and going, okay, is it in our interests to use this to start an international incident, because there are a lot of markets that they want to sell to. So what I'm highlighting that is to show how complicated it gets. In geopolitics, the things you say, the rhetoric is called signaling, and it is very important. It's hard to measure in the ways that we measure things in the physical sciences or engineering. But in the world of politics, often critically important. The other piece that is of significance with regard to rare earths in China, after the Mountain Pass mine closed in 2012, China did start hiking the prices. So Japan, the United States, and a few other countries appealed to the World Trade Organization. 2014, World Trade Organization rules in support of the United States and Japan, saying, look, you can't artificially increase these prices. So we've got international institutions that are functioning the way they are supposed to. Helium. Second most common element in the universe. However, we're running out of it on the planet Earth. Helium is used for a variety of different applications. One that most of us are familiar with in one form or another, MRIs, or around here people might be familiar with NMRs. Used in a number of different defense-related applications. This cliffside gas is considered a national resource. 40% of the United States helium comes from this single source of helium. It's actually, in some ways you can think of it like aquifers, except they're helium reservoirs. It's under Texas, Oklahoma. Recently, there was a discovery in Tanzania's Rift Valley that is estimated to represent about another 40% of the world's helium supplies. This was discovered by physicists from a British university. So looking at helium in Tanzania, hopefully, as it is being developed, people will be cognizant and avoid falling into the resource curse in international development. So as I conclude, found this fantastic slide from the American Chemical Association that highlights what they call the endangered elements. And these are elements that either have some sort of limited availability because they're being used up, because they are finite in some way, or because they have specific uses that are making them more attractive. That's a whole lot of the periodic table. So with that, I'm going to conclude. I want to say thank you all for your attention, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. Do we have questions in the audience?
Can we go back to the previous slide just to sort of take that in? Oh, yeah, sure. There's a lot to take in there. And as you may have noted, I tried to put some of the references, they're not all the references, but critical ones. You are welcome to reach out to me via email, and I'm happy to share the PDFs of these, share the slides with you. It was a fantastic project that I'm thankful Maureen asked and Matt asked me to do, because it's something isn't my usual work. Questions?
Question?
Who blinks first? The Western powers or China?
In what sense?
They can threaten to withhold supply. We can.
It depends. You can't answer that in general because it depends on the specific application that we're talking about. There are some things that we can either substitute something else. For example, it was recognized that we did not have any longer any place in the United States that was producing computer chips. So this was 10 years ago. The NSA set up something called the National Foundry that produces computer chips for national security significant applications. And American tax dollars go to pay for that. Now, who blinks first? Again, it depends. And it drives my students crazy, I'm sure, and this is also why I frequently don't get invited to a second time to many TV interviews. It's complicated. There isn't a 10-second soundbite. It's what are we talking about?
So you discussed where the U.S. and NATO were securing their uranium.
Can you use the mic, please?
You discussed where the U.S. and NATO were securing their uranium during World War II. Where was Germany? If they were developing the atomic bomb, where were they getting their uranium?
Great question. So they were attempting to get uranium ore from Czechoslovakia or the former Czechoslovakia. Now, our initial estimates, intelligence estimates of how far they were along, we actually were over-optimistic in what they could do. Now, we were under-optimistic in some other things having to do with, say, rockets. But in that case, they were depending on the Eastern European ore, and they did not have to rely on the African ore.
Yeah. Actually, the first question I was going to ask is, what is the relative proportion of commercial use versus military use for the rare earths? And then I can't help but wonder about what is putting pressure on silver and zinc.
So silver and zinc also are applications that have to do with electronics and energy. Now, I can give you a rough order of magnitude, but I wouldn't want you to take it because I just haven't looked at that sort of. My estimation would be probably in terms of the rare earths, less than, it's probably 10 to 15% is military, just because you've got so many more civilian applications. But this is where it's what are the applications? I mean, I love my iPhone. I'm part of that cult. But my iPhone is not a national strategic resource. We don't have to have that.
So how do you think the rarity of elements like copper, zinc, tin, germanium, the ones that are in solar cells and other renewable energy technologies, how much do you think that rarity will affect the use of renewable energy versus what policies might or might not be put in place?
That's a fascinating question. So as we dive into things like solar cells, in some ways my answer here is it's complicated. So some of the best metals for solar cells and some of the other photovoltaics are actually ones that we don't use a lot because they have incredibly environmentally problematic applications if they are in the wrong coordination system. So here's a place where China, not having environmental regulations, has continued to explore, and we've focused on some of these more, it isn't even just environmental, it's human health too. Human health often is the driver. We've focused on rarer elements for photovoltaics because those are things that are likely to be approved for commercial use, as well as if you have to go through the administrative hurdles to work with them in a commercial way. So that would be the piece that's driving it. Again, it's the money at the end. So much more complicated question, but a great one.
So thank you, it was a very interesting presentation. I had a question about, because you talked about how rare are they are rare because they are present in very low density. But do we have a good understanding of how they are present on as we go deeper, as we dig deeper into the Earth surface? Like, do we expect to find more as we go deeper? Like, because we said that some elements we are going to maybe run out of them, but we've been saying.
So if we're talking about the rare earths, and you're getting to the limitation of my knowledge. Remember, I'm the geopolitics, not the geology. So it's my understanding that as you go deeper into the earth, these are less likely to be found. So this is not something, it's, when we get deep in the earth, we can get iron. But again, back to the money, how it is. So my understanding, no. Do we know within places that are technically feasible to get to today and tomorrow? I don't have a good answer for that one.
So I have a question. You mentioned that there was a recent helium deposit discovered in, was it Tanzania?
Tanzania, the Rift Valley.
And then you mentioned the cobalt mines earlier. So how do these things tend to be, so it's discovered, and then presumably there's a bunch of countries, including China and us and others, that would like to get their hands on that. So how does that typically play out? I mean, how did China end up controlling the cobalt mines? Who's after the helium mines, and how does this typically happen?
So the helium reservoirs, Tanzania is trying to be thoughtful and learn from previous countries. They're setting up essentially sort of like their version of almost something of an Atomic Energy Commission, kind of, or NSF, to be able to do this as a natural resource more intentionally. Now, we're talking about Chinese acquisition of natural resources in the Congo and other places. They just come in and offer to buy them. Or they come in and they say, hey, we're going to build you roads. Or we're going to build you a stadium. And whereas the United States, when we do foreign aid, it is tied to things like, do you have good governance? Do you not imprison people randomly? Do you have fair and free elections? China comes and says, we don't care about that. And there have been a few examples of states that have made agreements with China, and they've said, you know what, we don't want to be letting potentially a second Chinese colonization where they are making these long-term leases, or China wants long-term leases. So it's a different ideological or different philosophical approach to foreign aid. And sometimes it's very hard if you're going to a group of people and China just built you a stadium. And so the people look at that and go, oh, that's fantastic. Well, I've got a stadium, we've got a road. It's harder. How do you get people to measure, well, you've got free and fair elections? Different political systems. I think there was another, yeah.
Thank you. I was excited to see in your program for today the reference to calls for a new international agreement on asteroid mining. That's fairly speculative, but did you have anything to tell us about that?
That is speculative, and that is where that's coming from, is this idea of, as we are looking forward, what is going to drive, and how are human beings going to deal with moving beyond the terrestrial sphere? So currently there are a number of different treaties. They're all really weak treaties. So the big one is called the Outer Space Treaty, which really just has to deal with you cannot put WMD in space. So this is an unanswered question to be problematized. Probably need to bring in and ask that question more to a lawyer rather than a chemist turned political scientist. But it's a good one.
We have time for one more question, if there's one more. Maureen?
Would there be any effect of climate change on the availability of these elements? I'm thinking of like the melting of the glaciers.
Yeah. I mean, my initial answer is one that I'm quite comfortable saying, which is I don't know. So I'm trying to make analogies. We know that because of climate change, we are seeing interest in the Arctic because people can access oil. I haven't seen anything where climate change is going to change the economics sufficiently in any of these places. And it may be one thing with respect to climate change that we don't need to worry about. There are a whole lot of other things that we do. So it's nice to put one thing off the table because the table is, got all sorts of other things on it.
All right, well, let's thank our speaker again.